So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Professor Michael Solomon. Hi, Professor. How are you doing? Or should I just say hi, Michael?
Michael will work. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, how are you doing today? Are you well?
I'm doing great, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You are very welcome. Well, Michael, you are the Professor of Marketing in the Haub School of Business at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. But I mean, that sounds really obvious, and it is probably really obvious, but for the benefit of our listeners and readers, I know there's so much more to you than just being a professor. Because tell us a bit about you and a bit about the work that you do.
I'll be happy to. My background is that I'm a psychologist by training. My PhD is in social psychology, but I've been working in a business school as a business school professor my entire career, and I basically started my career, and I won't. Don't worry, I won't give you a 30-minute synopsis of my career, but. But the reason I say I want to start at the beginning is that I did my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of fashion.
Oh, okay.
Which was a bit radical at the time, and much to the chagrin of my professors. I did something that actually had some real world significance, and it's just been downhill ever since. So is
that downhill? Is that downhill in the fashion stakes too, or is it?
Yeah, that is for me. My focus has always been on how material objects, expressive products like clothing and home furnishings and automobiles and many other products really play a very important role in our daily lives, and we often tend to overlook that. That they go much more beyond the function that they were designed to do. They really help us to define who we are and how we relate to others, what our aspirations are, and so on. So my career has focused on the field of consumer behavior, which is a subdiscipline of the marketing field.
Yeah.
And really have looked over the years at many different aspects of consumer behavior. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies in many different verticals, ranging from financial services to apparel and on and on. But basically focusing on the same issues that companies face, which is understanding their customers. And I've learned that many companies really may have the illusion that they understand their customers and the customer experience, but as you know very well, actually have a good way to go on that. So it's been a fascinating journey, I have to say.
Fantastic. Now, so on that, because I'm really excited because you recently published, the 12th edition, no less. This is not the first thing, but this is the 12th edition of this book, and I have it with me, and it is a weighty tome. And the book's called Consumer Behaviour, Buying, Having and Being. And now I believe it's primarily a university textbook, but it has much wider application and relevance. There's so much stuff in here, Michael. But can you tell me a little bit more about the book and how it came about and who it's for and so on and so forth, and also what's new in the 12th edition as compared to 11, 10, 9, etc., etc.?
Yeah, well, it seems like I've been writing that book and rewriting it my whole life, and the first edition came out in the late 1980s. So I'm not.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've been writing this book for a long time, and the reason I wrote it was that at the time there was beginnings of a real revolution in understanding consumers, because frankly, the field at that time was largely dominated by economists. No offense intended, Adrian, but
none taken.
We were starting to recognize that there was actually a lot going on in the area of consumption and what I would call the deep meanings of products that really weren't being captured, certainly by the textbooks at the time, and so I was approached to write this book, and when I stopped laughing, I realized that actually it probably would be a good idea to write a book that even the kind of level the playing field a bit in terms of integrating different different disciplinary approaches to consumer behavior. So essentially, the book was the first to incorporate not just a very rational, functional approach to consumer behavior, but also more of a you might say a subjective approach, looking at disciplines like sociology and anthropology and so on, and
sure.
and trying to cultivate a more even-handed approach. So the book actually, much to my surprise, was very well accepted by my colleagues and has gone on to be the most widely used book in the discipline worldwide. So I've managed to keep writing it all these years, and so just came out with the 12th edition about a year ago. And there, in a field like marketing, you do have to keep updating constantly because, sure, as you know very well, every day we wake up, there's something new, mm-hmm, and something that we took for granted becomes obsolete. So, it's a real challenge. It's not like writing an algebra book where things don't change a whole lot.
Sure.
So, in the new edition, for example, much more of a focus on behavioral economics, which is really starting, ironically, those economists are starting to come around to our point of view, and that is to look at some of the ways that consumer behavior is in fact not rational, but actually quite irrational. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of work, and by the way, in the UK, quite a lot of pioneering work that's even been done by the British government.
Yes, indeed.
On looking at nudges and so on, and how we engineer an environment to influence consumer behavior. So the new edition reflects a lot of that. It reflects, of course, a lot of the social media that changes literally day by day. Mm-hmm. And new technologies that I'm particularly excited about that are really revolutionizing the retail experience as well as the advertising experience, such as, for example, augmented reality and virtual reality. So, I update the book every 2 to 3 years, and let's just say I have no shortage of new material to put in.
I can imagine. Now, I mean, as we've sort of discussed, and as you know, it's like, I'm really interested in like all things to do with service, experience, employee engagement, and so on and so forth. I mean, and the book is cram-packed full of great ideas that are relevant to this area, but it's also the book's really relevant because there's this kind of a rising discussion, or this kind of big discussion around emotion and the role of emotion in sort of service and experience and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really relevant discussion. It's a very relevant book, and some of the stuff is in there. But I mean, the book is, as I say, it's very, very detailed, and there's a lot in it. But and rather than going through the book from end to end, I mean, I wonder if we can just pick out a couple of areas that I'd ask you to sort of tell me a little bit about, just so that people can get a flavour of the book, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the one thing, so I was going through the book, and there's a couple of things that stood out for me. So let's start with this first one, which is the positivist versus the interpretivist perspective on consumer behavior. And I looked at that, and I was reading it through, and I was like, wow. But it'd be great if you could tell me, what's that, and why is it important, and what should we be doing about it?
Yeah, well, as I said, the field, it's a relatively young field, right, looking specifically at consumer behavior, and really started, well, maybe a bit in the 50s, but a lot in the 1960s, and was really dominated by what you might think of as the scientific method.
Yeah.
And very careful testing, and in very highly controlled conditions, manipulating one thing, keeping everything else constant, and that's really the basis of the scientific method, and is very valuable in a lot of contexts. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, and this definitely applies to the service experience. consumer behavior is a bit messier than that because
Yes.
we don't behave the same way in the laboratory as we do in the field, and
Yes.
and I, actually, at the risk of dating myself, I have to say that I was one of the authors who invented the term the service encounter.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever come across that term, but back in the 1980s, when we first started to focus on the concept of services marketing and the understanding that the interaction, for example, between an employee and a customer is so important and so hard to quantify,
Sure.
in rarefied laboratory conditions. So,
Uh-huh.
so the interpretivist perspective essentially is, well, sometimes called a postmodern perspective. And what it means is that the researcher should not necessarily be totally objective and removed from the situation, because the researcher, essentially, you need to often immerse yourself in the situation in order to understand what's really going on. And a great example comes to us from anthropology, where and now we many companies often do what's called ethnographic research or
Yes.
ethnographies, and that's a great example of the interpretivist perspective, where rather than studying people as if they were lab rats, where you're separated from them, you actually become part of the lived experience. And so, it's a bit like Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, going to live with the natives in New Guinea. But in our case, if you're a services researcher, as you are, what it translates to is perhaps living with the department store employees as they wait on customers.
Yeah.
And really immersing yourself in that experience. So it's a very crucial distinction. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not devaluing the positivist approach, and there are many consumer behavior, issues that lend themselves very well to that. But we need to expand the focus and recognize that, especially when it involves a lot of human interaction,
Yes.
we really have to go beyond the laboratory, and that's why going into the field and really getting your hands dirty and, so to speak, fish where the fish are,
Yes.
is such an important perspective, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me think, though, however, Michael, that is there not a challenge with that, which is around, the observer effect?
Yes.
In terms of that, if I explain for the listeners, is that, the behavior of the observed changes under observation, particularly if the observed notices that they are, or understands that they're being observed. I mean, so how would an interpretivist perspective sort of adjust for that?
Well, it's a big problem in both cases.
Yeah.
It's a big problem for positivist research, because whenever we're brought into the laboratory to be in an experiment, we're very conscious about,
of course,
certain
yes.
biases, like, for example, pleasing the experimenter. People love to say, they'll usually say more positive things about a brand because they don't want to insult the company that's brought them in,
And they'll say anything for beer and pizza.
Yeah, exactly right. And of course, the observer effect that you mentioned is always looming in the background. But one way you get around it is you need to spend a little more time in the situation before you start measuring the situation, so
Right.
that the participants have accepted you and into the group to some extent. You haven't just turned up and you were sent there by corporate 5 minutes ago, and now they're expected to act natural. And of course, the real ethnographers like Margaret Mead would spend 5 to 10 years living in a village. We're not expecting people to do that quite, but once people do become more comfortable, even with when they know that their behavior is being recorded, let's say being videotaped, after a while they sort of lose that self-consciousness, and so the problem never goes away totally, but I think you can alleviate it to a large degree.
Yeah. And so that makes me think about, this idea that, it's a lot of people kind of say that it would be better if managers and leaders spent more time sort of either on the front line or with the frontline employees or walking around and talking to customers and things. But if they just did it in a sort of infrequent sort of way, then you don't get that, if you like, balancing off of the observation effect, I guess, or the socialization of
Yeah.
it.
I mean,
so it has to become a habit, I think is what I'm saying.
it has to become a much more regular occurrence. And if it's just, once every 6 months, somebody from the corporate office is going to show up on the plant floor, people are going to be on their best behavior that day. It's probably not even worth the time to do that,
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that. I mean, so then, as I was flicking through the book, the other thing that kind of that stood out for me, and I want you to ask you to sort of talk to, was this idea around ethics surrounding consumer behavior, because I actually also think there's a flip side of that. It's like ethics surrounding brand or corporate behavior. But let's start with the ethics surrounding consumer behavior part first. If you can explain to me kind of what some thoughts around that.
So you're referring to how consumers are behaving with companies?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the downsides, we've kind of opened this Pandora's box that's called social media.
Yes.
And one of the downsides is, I guess, from many managers' perspectives at least, is that consumers are much more in control over the interactions they have with companies. And what that means is that they can, the devil comes out a bit, and they're able to manipulate the messages that they get from companies to a much greater degree. So, for example, posting fake videos online that purport to be an actual commercial for a company, many of which look quite realistic. And they've done a lot of, damage to some companies in that sense. There are other issues. For example, shoplifting, of course, is a major problem and costs companies and the economy many millions of dollars or pounds or euros, and so things like that and all. But more generally, I think there's frankly a sense of consumer frustration. There's a lot of distrust right now of big corporations.
Yeah.
We hear, of course, a lot of discourse about income inequality, and that tends to erode the trust that consumers have. Products that are tainted in some way and are dangerous to people, and so really the onus is on both consumers and companies to repair that bond that used to be there to a much greater degree. So to some extent, companies have earned this mistrust, frankly, but having said that, especially for the millennial generation, ethics are very important to them, and one part of that, and when you talk about enhancing the customer experience, one of the easiest ways to do that, ironically, is just to be a good citizen.
Sure. Yeah.
And so doing, CSR, corporate social responsibility, showing that you're giving back to the community, that is a great way to ramp up customer involvement. And we know that all things equal, people are going to buy from a company that they believe is ethical and that gives back to the community. They're going to choose that company over another.
Yeah.
So ethics is good business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing that was an area that sort of stands out now. I know it's been around. I mean, the field of study has been around for a while, and the one I'm referring to is semiotics. But I don't know if it's one that's particularly well understood and also well applied to sort of the service or just overall kind of customer experience. I mean, can you explain to me what semiotics is and the power of it?
Well, semiotics is the study of symbolism,
right,
essentially, and actually most of the emphasis is in France. Many French theorists have written extensively about it, but it's actually a very complicated field, and it's a bit. I kind of think of it as verbal mathematics. I mean, when you look at true semioticians and what they do, and I'm not one of them, but
sure,
I have a lot of admiration for what they do simply because I don't understand most of it. But essentially, what you're looking at, and you're recognizing that a symbol, like let's say a visual, let's say a company logo, for example, is a very, very powerful platform that carries a lot of meaning.
Right.
And so you ignore that at your peril. And, and in the services area, I can give you a really great example of that. And that is that,
Yeah, please do.
That actually, as you know very well in your own work, the more intangible something is that you're selling,
Mm-hmm.
the more difficult it is to sell. So, many people sales professionals have told me that something like life insurance is probably the hardest thing to sell because people can't hold on to it and they only realize the benefits after they're dead.
Yes.
And so basically, the more intangible your offering is, the more important the semiotics of it are. So let's stick with insurance for a minute. There's a great example of a very intangible service. And if you look at many of the successful insurance companies, you'll see that they actually have a symbol that tends to make more concrete their offering. So, for example, Prudential has the Rock of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Travelers has an umbrella. We say you're in good hands with Allstate, and Allstate Insurance has the two hands that go together. And so, this is done for a reason, because these are the things that the everyday person can understand. And many other services, the airlines, for example, they're not going to emphasize the relative safety of flying in an airplane versus riding in a car, even though it's much safer to take a journey in an airplane.
Yeah.
They're going to emphasize the comfort of first class and perhaps the uniforms of their flight attendants.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's an example of semiotics at work, and it reminds us that every visual, every tangible aspect of your brand identity has to be very carefully monitored and controlled.
Which, in that, to put, you just made me think about another insurer, which is LV here in the UK, which is Liverpool Victoria, the insurance company, but their symbol is LV with two little dashes, and the logo looks like the word love.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's
great.
That's very clever.
Yeah, and very, very important. I mean, if you go to buy a car, there's lots of intangibles about the car, but the fact is that you can take a test drive, and you can't do that with a service.
Yeah.
So people need something to hold on to mentally.
Yeah. So the other thing I'm interested in, and it kind of pops up in the book as well, is that, and I think this is a danger and something I've written about sort of before, is the cross-cultural differences that exist between different consumers, because not all consumers are made the same, right? And I just would be interested to hear your thoughts on that, or am I wrong? Mm-hmm. And they are all made the same.
No, there are certainly many differences, and culture is a huge factor, and I often think of it as a goldfish swimming around in a little bowl, and the goldfish really doesn't understand how important the water is in that bowl until somebody spills him onto the floor.
Yeah,
he flops around and he realizes that that's what was keeping him alive. And so, today when we look at consumer behavior, it's so important to recognize many of the unseen but incredibly powerful cultural differences that shape us all. And some of them are obvious. If you when you travel around, you look at norms that, and habits, things that people take for granted. So in the UK, like in the US, for something easy, we tend to eat dinner fairly early, and the people in Spain think we're crazy because you go to a restaurant in Spain at 7 in the evening, the only people who are going to be there are the British and the Americans.
Yes.
And something like that is fairly obvious. But more fundamentally, when brands look to expand their markets, and as they are naturally inclined to do, they sometimes have, I guess, what you might say, the arrogance of assuming that just because they do it a certain way in their host country, it should be done the same way elsewhere. And
sure.
And so the marketing graveyard is full of dead bodies. Companies that have tried to just basically clone themselves elsewhere. So there's a lot of argument and debate, especially in the advertising area. Should we standardize our advertising and have economies of scale and only produce one ad that goes everywhere, or should we customize our appeal to each individual market? And the answer is pretty clear, I think, that customization, is more expensive, but is really worth it. Now, having said that, for better or worse, we are seeing in the services area a lot of homogenization, as companies like Starbucks start popping up in China, in Italy and places like that where you wouldn't think they would succeed. But even companies like that, and companies like, say, the American company Coca-Cola, which is largely standardized, you'll notice that while their message is standardized, they customize the way they execute it in each country that they're in. So they're going to use local actors, and Starbucks might use local artisans to design a store in Birmingham versus one in Madrid.
Yeah.
So you ignore this at your peril, and some big retailers have done this, like Walmart, for example, has actually failed or not done very well in some countries like Germany, where expectations about what the encounter should be between a salesperson and a customer might be quite different, and you have to adapt to that.
I think that, on that point, I think it's absolutely sort of relevant. I was speaking to a friend, and she's really interested in this. She comes from a very sort of mixed sort of background, from lots of different influences, and she was saying that what's fascinating is how the perception of what good service is in different kind of places can be across different communities and across different sort of cultures and countries and so forth, can be radically different, and that can have a huge impact on like a delivery model. So it's almost to your point. She was talking about this idea that in the sort of the Middle East or the the Indian subcontinent or Africa, those type of countries, or for example, is that almost the measure from their cultural perspective is almost like how welcoming you are is a measure of how wealthy you are, or how wealthy you're seen by your society and your community, which can be very, very different to other places in the world. If that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, some cultures have set the bar quite low in terms of expectations. If you think about Russia, for example, and the idea of customer service, I think, is basically non-existent, and so that also creates opportunities, because if you set the bar so low,
yes,
the way you create a wonderful customer experience, I think, is just to meet, or more importantly, exceed expectations.
But I think, but to your point, I think, is that you've got to understand those to be able to really work well with them, I guess, before you can do it. You can't just adopt a homogenous approach and expect everything to be rosy.
Absolutely, and that goes back to the point I made earlier about fishing where the fish are. You can't just read about a culture. You have to have people on the ground who really understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, I've picked out some things, but from your perspective, you're the expert in the sort of consumer behavior and understanding it and things. What are there any things that you say added to the book, or that are new, that you think these are areas that marketeers, customer experience people, service people, that they should be paying attention to and learning more about, but they're not quite there yet?
Well, I think one of the most important challenges, probably the biggest challenge that marketers have today with regard to consumers, is engaging them
Right.
and dealing with apathetic customers or customers who, much to the frustration of the manager, believe that all the brands in a category are pretty much the same.
Right.
And every manager hates to hear that because in their minds there's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the issues in consumer behavior and the strategic insights that come from that, I think, relate to basically, well, there's a term that I like to use, which is ROI. But when I use the term, I don't mean return on investment. I mean return on involvement.
Okay.
And so what I mean by that is that customer involvement and understanding the extent to which your customers are currently motivated to even process information about your offering is the central challenge you face. Mm-hmm. And depending on where they are along that spectrum, the types of strategies that you use to engage them will be quite different. So dealing with someone who is buying what they perceive to be a very mundane experience or offering is very different than dealing with a fanatical customer who is, lining up outside the Apple store,
sure,
camping out overnight waiting for the next release.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not all products can be Apple iPhones, but there are strategies to basically move consumers up what I think of as a pyramid of involvement. And mm-hmm. And I talk a lot about this in my keynotes and seminars and so on, where you can move people up from the lowest level, which is just awareness, and that's very important. Just to build awareness for your brand is quite a challenge in our media saturated environment.
Yeah.
And then moving them up and up and up until you might reach the apex of that pyramid, which is what I call resonance. Mm-hmm. And when you have a resonant brand, that means that it becomes part of the consumer's identity, and they really think of it as part of who they are. And there are many brands like that, but not as many as there could be. So
yeah,
a lot of people say, well, I have this boring brand and nobody's going to think it's part of who they are. And yet you can always point to exceptions where there are categories where, something like bottled water, for example, where now and then a company will really do something that elevates the meaning of that brand to something that's much more important to the customer. So
yeah.
So there are many different ways to accomplish these things, but I think the most important thing is for managers just to recognize that it is possible to engage consumers. There are strategies to do it, but they have to start somewhere, and that somewhere is often just by acknowledging that maybe their customers aren't engaging now the way they could be.
Mm. Yeah, no, I engagement is a huge challenge. I mean, the way that I think about it, sometimes I like to sort of almost think about it from a perspective of, or characterize the relationship as like a personal relationship, and say that most relationships have these two dynamics in them, and one is interesting and one is interested. And it seems to me a lot of brands are trying to be just too much interesting and not enough interested, and therefore it becomes slightly one-sided. And it's even though we're in this social era that most brands are still too broadcast, and it's still too much look at me, trying to in this kind of grab for attention. But actually, sometimes the most attention grabbing stuff can be the ones where you actually do something that is of relevance and interest to the customers by doing something which sort of matters to them, as it were, which I think is your point.
That's absolutely correct. And and I think you're right that most brands haven't figured this out yet. But ironically, we have this thing called the internet and social media, which I think is going to be around for a while.
You think?
And it does. I don't think it's a fad, but it could be. You never know. But it does give even a large brand the ability to personalize their delivery. And we know from research that consumers, as you say, do form relationships with brands, and those relationships are remarkably similar to the relationships they have with other people. So they can be love relationships, they can be hate relationships, they can be master-slave relationships. There are many different kinds that researchers have identified. But the important thing is that they are relationships, and it's almost better to be in a hate relationship than to have no relationship, if you know what I mean, because at least there's a connection there, and the consumer is actively thinking about your brand.
Yeah, nothing worse than indifference.
Absolutely, yes.
So, Michael, I mean, this consumer behavior and things is a huge area, and if somebody who's listening to this or reading the highlights and they're thinking, right, I want to better understand my my customers, I want to do more to better understand it, and if I was to say to you, what would be the one thing that you would recommend that people do more of to help build their understanding of their customers? What would it be, do you think?
Well, I could be mercenary and say they should contact me and go to my website, but I don't think that's what you're asking me.
You can do that at the end. That's fine.
Now, I think that what they might do is the Japanese have an expression which is called going to the gemba, Gemba, and
Okay.
I talk about it in the book. And what that means is that the true understanding of something can only be achieved by being at the place where it occurs.
Okay.
And putting that in the context of a service, then, what I was saying earlier about fishing where the fish are.
Sure.
Actually walking through whatever the experience is, maybe it's shopping in a store, maybe it's dining in a restaurant, maybe it's buying insurance. Understand that experience not from the manager's perspective, but from the customer's perspective. And you can only do that by becoming the customer, I think.
Right.
It's not enough to commission a research firm to go out and document the experience for you. I think every manager needs to be in the shoes of his or her customer at some point. And I don't mean just in a holistic sense. I mean going through every step and understanding that, let's say that you're operating an appliance, say you sell a washing machine, understanding from the consumer's perspective, in kind of a micro way, every single step that has to occur and where there might be confusion. And so we know, for example, in the tech area, we think about something like DVD players, let's say, or objects like that. When you look at the many of them that are returned because they didn't work properly, it turns out that the majority of those units that have been returned were returned not because they weren't functioning, but because the customer didn't understand the instructions.
Sure. Absolutely. So, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I would potentially go ask people to go a little bit further and turn around and say, actually, I would encourage people to try and spend their own money with the firms that they work for, just to get that complete and visceral experience of what it's actually like. Whether it's in a restaurant or it's ordering something, or even if you simulate. Or you borrow some money, you take the company's money and do that, but actually do the research and the spending and the ordering and the delivery, or all of these different sort of elements, or buy something in a store, or from an office or whatever it might be, take delivery of something, just because there's one thing to, as you say, to observe it, and another thing to experience it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And for example, as a lot of companies use secret shoppers or mystery shoppers. to me that's lazy. That's outsourcing something. Your employees should be the secret shoppers and do exactly what you're advocating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Michael, that sort of now I'm conscious of time, but I've got a couple of more questions I want to ask you, and the first one is sort of my own piece of sort of market research. So, as you know, last year I wrote a book called sort of How to Wow, and every time I do one of these interviews, I'm asking everybody that I speak to for their perspective on what wow service or wow experience is to them. So I'd be interested in getting your perspective on that.
Well, I think wow service is, as we said earlier, over delivering.
Okay.
And surprising the customer and in a pleasant way, not in an unpleasant way.
Sure.
And really the way to do that, I think, is personalization. And so much of the pushback that we see is that we're living in a world that is essentially making us anonymous. Now on social media, you're just the opposite. That we have privacy issues and so on. But I mean, in the old days, back in the last century, you knew the people that you shopped with, that you bought from in your local community, and most of us, especially in urban areas, no longer have that sense of connection. So I think a lot of wow experiences, it doesn't mean that you have to know the life history of every customer, but just making the effort to customize your interaction with them so that you recognize, you have some empathy for what they're going through. And, a great example, you may be familiar with the company Zappos, American company. And they, in their call centers, they don't reward people based on the volume of calls that they handle. They reward them on the quality of those calls, and they encourage the people in the call centers to actually chat with the person and not rush them through the call, and almost to befriend them. And I think a lot of customers who hang up from Zappos after they've had that kind of interaction might, to use your term, might say, wow, that's so different than the last 10 calls I've had with companies, or a company like Disney, which obviously does a great job and actually teaches other companies how to essentially put on a performance. So Disney recognizes that a service encounter is essentially a theatrical performance. And the wow experience should be the one that you have when you walk out of a wonderful play and you feel transformed.
Yeah.
And it is quite possible to do that without sacrificing a whole lot of efficiency. So to me, that's what a wow experience is feeling that there has been some kind of transformation and that you have been acknowledged as an individual person and not just as a number.
Perfect. So, Michael, that brings me to my last question, and that I always ask on the end of these interviews. And the question is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Oh, I can be as shameless as the next guy.
Go on, go for it.
What I'm very excited about right now is that I'm developing some online courses that relate to understanding customers and basically improving your business performance by understanding your customers. So if I can plug anything, it would be just to ask people to go to my website, which is michaelrsolomon.com.
Okay.
michaelrsolomon.com, and you'll see some free resources there that you can download on customer engagement, but you'll also see a link to courses, and if you follow that link, you'll see the first course that I have up, which does focus on consumer behavior, but with a very actionable focus especially for people in small to medium-sized businesses to really get inside the minds of their customers and understand why they buy. So thank you for the opportunity. michaelrsolomon.com would be the place.
Perfect. Michael, that's fantastic. I will make sure that we get that all, when we do all the editing and things, we'll get all that written up and linked up and make sure that everybody gets pointed in the right direction to your website. But just wanted to say thank you for sharing your time and your insight. I would also kind of say to people, if they're really interested, you should go and check out Consumer Behaviour 12th edition as well, because there's just a huge amount of stuff in there too. But so that's my plug on your behalf. But yeah, just to say thank you once again for your time and your insight. That's been great.
Well, thank you as well. I've enjoyed it, and I really appreciate the contributions you're making with this program.